The town was small, quiet, and far away from the busy cities. People there knew each other by name, and every morning the same faces could be seen walking to work, buying bread, or sitting on benches in the town square. Life moved slowly in this place, but not everyone was happy. Behind the simple homes and friendly greetings, there were hidden struggles, and some families barely had enough to eat. The sheriff of the town lived alone in a large house at the edge of the main road. Everyone respected him because he kept order and protected them from trouble. He wore his uniform neatly every day and his boots always shined. But once he stepped inside his home, silence followed him everywhere. The rooms were wide. The kitchen had more food than one person could finish, but there was no one waiting for him. No sound of children's laughter. No family at the table. He ate his meals alone, listening only to the ticking of the old clock on the wall. People admired his position, but no one noticed how much he longed for company. In another part of the town, a poor woman lived with her 2 children in a small wooden hut. The roof leaked when it rained, and the cold wind came through the cracks in the walls. Her children often cried at night, not because they were sick, but because their stomachs were empty. She worked hard, washing clothes for others, carrying water, and doing any small task people offered, but her earnings were never enough. She used to have a husband, but he had passed away, leaving her with only memories and responsibilities. Every day she looked at her children's thin faces and wished she could give them more. One winter evening, when the air was cold and the streets were almost empty, the woman made a difficult decision. She had nothing left to feed her children that night. Her small pot was empty and her cupboard had only dust. The children sat quietly in the corner, shivering under a thin blanket. With tears in her eyes, she whispered to them that she would return with food. But in her heart, she did not know where she could find it. Her feet carried her through the streets until she stopped in front of the sheriff's house. It was not planned, but something inside her told her to knock on his door. The sheriff was known to be strict, but she had also seen moments of kindness in his eyes when he spoke to the townspeople. She stood there for a moment, shivering in the cold, then finally gathered courage and knocked. Inside, the sheriff had just finished his supper. He heard the knock and frowned, wondering who would come at such an hour. When he opened the door, the sight before him surprised him. A thin woman stood there, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders and her eyes filled with both fear and courage. She did not ask for money, she did not ask for pity. Instead, she spoke in a trembling but honest voice. "I will end your loneliness if you give us food, please." The sheriff was taken aback. He had expected someone asking for coins or complaining about a neighbor, but this woman's words touched him deeply. Loneliness, she had spoken the very word that lived quietly inside him every night. He looked at her carefully, noticing the tired lines on her face, the worn shoes on her feet, and the quiet hope in her eyes. For a moment, silence hung between them. The sheriff thought about his empty dining table, the extra bread still lying in his kitchen, and the quietness that always surrounded him. Then he thought about her 2 children, who must be waiting in the cold, hungry, and tired. Something inside him shifted. Without speaking much, he stepped aside and invited her in. The woman entered slowly, her hands still trembling. She had not expected him to open the door, let alone invite her in. The sheriff went to the kitchen and brought out bread, warm soup, and some leftover meat. He placed them gently on the table. The woman's eyes filled with tears, not only because of the food, but because of the unexpected kindness. She whispered thank you again and again, and the sheriff nodded silently. That night, she carried the food back to her hut, where her children's faces lit up at the sight of it. They ate with joy, smiling for the first time in days. The woman sat beside them, thinking about the sheriff. She remembered how his eyes softened when she spoke those words at his door. She had not meant them as a promise, only as a desperate truth. She had noticed his loneliness before, the way he walked alone through the town. In her moment of need, she had spoken what came from her heart, and he had listened. Meanwhile, the sheriff sat alone again at his large wooden table, but the silence felt different. He thought about her words. "I will end your loneliness." No one had ever spoken to him like that before. He realized how true it was. Food he had in plenty, but companionship was what he lacked most. That evening, for the first time in many years, he felt that his house was not just a place of silence. Someone had entered with honesty and need, and in giving her food, he felt he had received something too, a sense of connection. As the clock ticked into the night, He could not forget the look in her eyes, a mix of strength and pain. He wondered about her children, about how hard her life must be. The sheriff, known for his strictness, felt a new warmth inside him. He did not yet know that this moment at the door would change his life. But he sensed that something important had begun. The next morning, when he stepped out for his daily walk through town, he noticed her from a distance carrying water with her children following behind. She looked tired, but she also looked grateful. When their eyes met, she gave him a small nod and he returned it. Neither spoke, but both knew something had shifted between them. This was only the beginning, the quiet start of a bond born not from wealth or power, but from a simple act of honesty and kindness. The sheriff, once trapped in his lonely silence, now found himself thinking about the woman and her children. And the woman, once too afraid to ask for help, now knew there was someone who had listened. The days after that night seemed ordinary to most people in the small town, but for the sheriff and the poor woman, something quiet yet meaningful had started. The woman continued her daily struggles, washing clothes by the river and carrying heavy bundles back to the houses that paid her a few coins. Her children followed her sometimes, helping in little ways, though their small arms grew tired quickly. At night she returned to their hut with aching shoulders and a heavy heart. Yet there was a difference now. She knew that in the town stood one man who had listened, who had opened his door when she knocked with empty hands. That memory gave her a little hope every morning. The sheriff, on the other hand, could not forget her words. He went about his duties with the same discipline as before, walking the streets, speaking to shopkeepers, settling disputes. But deep inside, the loneliness that had followed him for years felt less sharp. Whenever he passed near the poor quarter of town, he found his eyes searching for her without even realizing it. Sometimes he would see her struggling with laundry or carrying water, and his steps slowed, though he did not approach. He wondered how someone so fragile could carry so much strength. One afternoon, the sheriff was at the marketplace when he noticed her standing quietly by a fruit stall. She was counting her coins again and again, and finally, with a sad smile, she handed the seller only enough for 2 small apples. The seller, knowing her situation, gave her an extra one, and she thanked him warmly. The sheriff watched from a distance, his heart tightening as he imagined how those 3 apples would be divided among 3 hungry mouths that night. For the first time, he felt restless. He had food in his own home that often went to waste, yet here she was, stretching her coins for scraps. That evening, when he returned home, he packed some bread, dried meat, and vegetables into a small basket. He told himself he was only doing his duty as a man of the town, ensuring no family starved. He left the basket near her door while the night was still young, then quietly walked away. The woman found it later, and though she knew at once who had left it, she did not chase after him. Instead, she held the basket close, whispering a prayer of thanks. The sheriff did not stop at one basket. Over the next few days, he found excuses to pass by her hut. Sometimes he left food, sometimes firewood, and sometimes a blanket. He never stayed to watch her reaction, but in his heart, he could picture the children's joy. The woman soon understood that his help came from more than pity. It came from a hidden kindness he tried to keep quiet. She began to look for him whenever she walked through town, not to ask for anything, but to offer a smile of gratitude. The townspeople noticed. Whispers began in the market and at the well. "Have you seen the sheriff near the poor widow's hut?" Some asked. Others shrugged, saying he was only doing his duty. But curiosity grew. The sheriff was a man of law and authority, respected for his stern discipline. To see him soften toward a poor woman raised eyebrows. Some gossiped unkindly, suggesting she was using him. Others said it was good that the sheriff finally had someone to care about. The sheriff heard the whispers but paid them no mind. He was not ashamed. Yet he also knew the woman was sensitive to such talk, so he kept his visits quiet. But one day, as he walked through town, he saw her children sitting on the steps of the church, their cheeks rosy from the cold. They greeted him shyly, and he stopped to speak with them. Their small voices and innocent laughter touched him deeply. He had never known the warmth of children in his home, and now, standing before them, he felt something stir within him, something that was not duty, but affection. Soon after, the sheriff began inviting them to his house. At first, the woman refused politely, worried about what people would say. But the sheriff insisted gently, reminding her that his large house was too empty and that sharing food was not a crime. Finally, she agreed. The first time they entered, the children's eyes widened at the big wooden chairs, the fireplace, and the shelves filled with books. The sheriff watched their wonder with a quiet smile. That evening, they shared a meal together. The sheriff served them himself, making sure the children had enough on their plates. For the first time, his dining table was filled with laughter and small voices. The woman sitting across from him felt both grateful and uneasy. She had never imagined eating in the sheriff's home. She kept her eyes lowered, but every now and then, she glanced at him and saw not just a man in uniform, but a lonely human being who had opened his heart. After dinner, the sheriff surprised the children by showing them his old chessboard. He taught them the rules patiently, laughing when they made mistakes and applauding when they learned quickly. The poor woman sat quietly watching this scene. Her heart softened in a way she could not describe. She had come to his door out of desperation, and yet now her children were laughing under his roof. As weeks passed, the sheriff grew closer to the family. He would often walk with them in the evenings, the children skipping happily at his side. He carried their water buckets when he found them struggling, and sometimes he gave them small coins to buy sweets. Slowly, he became more than just a sheriff to them. He became a protector, a fatherly figure, someone who filled the emptiness left by their lost father. But not everyone in the town looked kindly on this bond. Some whispered that the woman was clever, using her children to win the sheriff's heart. Others mocked the sheriff quietly, saying he had grown weak. The woman heard these whispers and felt shame burning inside her. She worried that her presence would ruin the sheriff's reputation. But when she tried to distance herself, the sheriff noticed at once. One evening, when she hesitated to bring her children to his house, he walked to her hut instead. Sitting outside with her, he spoke firmly yet gently. "Do not listen to what others say. I know the truth. I know your heart. You asked me for food once, not for gold, not for riches. And I gave it because I wanted to. Do not let their words keep you away." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She realized then that his kindness was not a passing gesture. He truly saw her not as a beggar, not as a burden, but as a person with dignity. She nodded slowly, and from that day she no longer let whispers control her. For the sheriff, every moment with them made his house brighter. The silence that once followed him home now felt like a memory from another life. He often thought back to that night at the door when she had said, "I will end your loneliness if you give us food." At the time, it had sounded like desperate words from a starving mother. But now he felt their deeper meaning. Indeed, his loneliness was ending, slowly but surely, because of her and her children, and so, what began as a single knock on a cold night had turned into something the sheriff never expected. A bond that was healing his lonely heart and giving hope to a poor family who had once thought they were forgotten. The bond between the sheriff and the poor woman's family grew slowly, like a tree that takes root and spreads its branches quietly over time. At first it was just meals shared together, or small gifts of food and wood. But as weeks turned into months, the sheriff's house began to feel alive in ways it never had before. Where once there had been silence, now there were voices. Where once the air carried only the sound of the ticking clock, now it carried laughter, footsteps, and the gentle hum of conversation. The children were the first to fill the empty spaces of the house. They treated the sheriff's big home as if it were a playground. The little boy loved to run down the hallways, pretending to be a soldier like the sheriff, while the girl liked to sit by the fireplace with a book the sheriff had given her. The sheriff found himself smiling more often, not out of duty or politeness, but because their joy warmed his heart. He had not known how much he needed the sound of children's laughter until it echoed within his own walls. The poor woman was more reserved. Each time she stepped into the sheriff's home, she felt both comfort and unease. She had been raised to never depend on anyone, and yet here she was, sharing meals at the table of the most respected man in town. Sometimes she worried that people's whispers were right, that others might think she was using him, but every time she saw the sheriff playing chess with her children, or helping them with simple tasks, her heart softened. She knew his kindness was genuine and it was not pity. He needed them as much as they needed him. One evening, the sheriff decided to speak openly. After dinner, when the children were busy arranging the chess pieces, he turned to the woman and said quietly, "Do you know what your words meant that night you knocked on my door?" She looked at him, unsure what he meant. He continued, "You said you would end my loneliness if I gave you food. At first I thought it was just a way to beg, but now I realize you were telling the truth. Look at this table. Look at my house. I am no longer alone. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly lowered her gaze. I only spoke from my heart that night, she whispered. I was desperate, but I also saw the loneliness in you. Maybe we both needed each other without knowing. The sheriff nodded. He felt a deep respect for her honesty. Unlike many who came to him asking for favors, she had never asked for anything beyond food for her children. She'd given him something no one else had offered. A chance to be more than just a sheriff, a chance to be a man with a family. But not everyone understood this bond. Some townspeople grew suspicious. They saw the sheriff walking with the woman and her children, carrying water buckets for them or stopping to talk in the market. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the woman was clever, that she had trapped the sheriff with her words. Others said the sheriff had grown soft, forgetting his duty as a strict man of law. A few even laughed behind his back, mocking the idea of a sheriff sharing his home with beggars. The woman heard these words one morning when she went to the well. A group of women whispered loudly enough for her to hear. Look at her, one said, walking around like a queen now that the sheriff protects her. Another added, she will ruin his good name. Mark my words. The poor woman's face burned with shame. She hurried away with her water pot, but their words cut deep. That night, as she watched her children fall asleep after eating a meal the sheriff had shared, she sat in silence, torn between gratitude and guilt. The next time the sheriff invited her to his home, she hesitated. She told him quietly that maybe it was better if they stopped coming so often. People are talking, she said. I don't want to bring shame to you. The sheriff looked at her firmly, his voice calm but strong. Do you think I care about whispers? Let them talk. I know the truth. You are not taking anything from me. You are giving me what I needed most. Do not let their words steal that from us. She wanted to believe him, but her heart was heavy. She thought of her children. What kind of future would they have if everyone in town looked at them with suspicion? The sheriff saw her worry and softened his tone. I have lived in silence for years, he said. Do you know what it feels like to sit at a table with too much food and no one to share it with? It is a pain deeper than hunger. You ended that for me, and I will not give it up because of gossip. Hearing this, the woman's eyes filled with tears. She realized he was not a man of pride, but a man of truth. Slowly, she began to let go of her fear. If the sheriff was willing to stand by them, then perhaps they could face the whispers together. Over time, their bond grew stronger. The sheriff not only shared food and warmth, but also taught the children skills. He showed the boy how to polish boots, how to tie knots, and how to stand tall with confidence. He taught the girl how to read from his books, encouraging her curiosity and praising her when she learned new words. The children adored him, calling him uncle at first, then slipping into calling him father when they forgot themselves. The sheriff never corrected them. Instead, he smiled each time he heard it. The poor woman saw these changes with a mixture of joy and fear. Joy because her children finally had a figure to guide them, someone who cared deeply for them. Fear because she knew nothing in life came without cost, and she worried what the future might hold. Yet every time she saw the sheriff's eyes soften when her children hugged him, she felt reassured. The town could not ignore what was happening. More whispers spread, but some began to see the truth with their own eyes. They noticed how the sheriff looked happier, how his once stern face now carried warmth. They noticed how the poor woman still worked hard every day, never asking for more than what she needed. Slowly, a few townspeople began to soften their judgment. Still, the bond faced its hardest test when a crisis struck the town. A season of bad harvest led to shortages of food. Prices in the market rose, and people began to hoard what little they had. Hunger returned, not just for the poor, but for many families who had never known it before. Suspicion grew quickly, and when a few sacks of grain went missing from the storehouse, angry fingers pointed toward the poorest families. The woman's name was whispered among them. The sheriff knew this was not the end of their trials. His bond with the poor woman had already tested him against gossip, but now it would test him against the anger of the entire town. And deep inside, he knew he had to stand firm, not just as a sheriff, but as the man who had found new life in the words of a desperate woman on a cold night. The food shortage shook the town like a sudden storm. People ran from market to market searching for grain, bread, and vegetables, often finding empty shelves. Fear and frustration filled the air, and whispers turned into accusations. Many eyes that had once watched the poor woman with quiet judgment now glared at her openly. Some accused her of stealing the town's food. claiming she was clever enough to take more than she needed. Even neighbors who had been friendly before crossed the street to avoid her. The woman felt the weight of the town's suspicion immediately. She stayed close to her children, holding their hands tightly whenever someone passed. Her heart raced whenever she heard angry voices, and tears would rise to her eyes when she thought of the sheriff. Would he still help them if the town turned against them? The children sensed her fear, asking quietly why people were being so mean, and she had no words to reassure them fully. All she could do was keep them close and pray for safety. The sheriff heard the rumors on the wind, whispered at the market and carried by the concerned neighbors who came to him. He had to act quickly, for his role as a protector demanded both fairness and courage. But more than that, he felt a personal responsibility. This was no longer about law or reputation. It was about the family that had brought warmth and laughter into his lonely home. He decided to confront the situation directly. He called a meeting at the town square, inviting the townspeople to hear the truth from him. The poor woman and her children stood by his side, quiet but steadfast. The crowd gathered, murmuring with curiosity and skepticism. Many of the townspeople doubted the woman's intentions. They whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others muttering about how easily the sheriff could be deceived. The sheriff stepped forward, his uniform neat, his boots polished, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "I know there are questions about this family," he began calmly. "I know that some of you think they have taken what does not belong to them, but I have seen their lives. I have watched their struggles. I know the truth, and I will not let anyone speak lies about them." A hush fell over the crowd. The sheriff continued, telling them of the first night when the woman had knocked at his door. He described her courage, her honesty, and the fear she carried in her eyes. "She did not ask for money or gold," he said. "She only asked for food so her children could eat. And in that moment I saw the truth of her heart." He went on to tell the townspeople about her tireless work, the way she labored day after day, and the care she showed her children. He spoke about the laughter that now filled his house and how it had changed him. "I was lonely," he said softly. "I lived in silence. This family has given me life and joy, not out of greed, but because they are people of dignity. I will stand by them no matter what anyone says." Some townspeople frowned, their faces tight with doubt. Others listened quietly, feeling shame for having doubted them. Still, the sheriff's words carried weight. People respected him, not just for his position, but for the integrity that shone through in his voice. Slowly, the anger and suspicion began to melt. The townspeople realized that they had judged too quickly. The woman stood beside the sheriff, holding her children close. She felt a mixture of fear, relief, and pride. She had never imagined that the sheriff would defend them publicly, that he would risk the town's judgment to protect her and her children. Her eyes met his briefly, and she nodded silently. She understood the depth of his courage, and she felt her own courage growing in return. As the weeks passed, the sheriff's support helped the family survive the shortage. He provided extra food, ensured that neighbors would not turn them away, and quietly guided the town to offer help. Slowly, the children grew healthier, their laughter returning even in the shadow of scarcity. The woman began to smile more, realizing that life was not only about struggle but also about the kindness of others, and how it could lift spirits even in the darkest times. The sheriff and the family continued to grow closer. He showed them that strength was not only in authority but also in compassion. Together, they faced the challenges of the town's shortage and came out stronger. He began to see himself differently, no longer as a solitary man defined by duty, but as someone who could love, protect, and share life with others. The town, too, started to change. People began to notice the woman's honesty, her care for her children, and the sheriff's unwavering support. Slowly, admiration replaced suspicion. They saw that her courage had brought something valuable to the town, a reminder that wealth or position meant little without kindness. And they began to respect the sheriff even more, for standing up not for himself, but for the vulnerable. One afternoon, the sheriff invited the woman and her children to help him in the garden behind his house. It was small, but it could grow vegetables to supplement their meals. He handed the children small tools and showed them how to plant seeds carefully. The woman smiled as her children worked beside him, their hands dirty but their eyes bright with joy. The sheriff knelt beside them, planting seeds himself, laughing when the boy dropped a seed or the girl overwatered a plant. This simple activity strengthened the bond further. The sheriff and the woman began to trust each other deeply, understanding that their connection was built on respect, not dependency. The children felt safe and loved, experiencing a stability they had never known, and the sheriff felt alive, no longer confined by the walls of his large, empty home. Yet even with these small victories, the shadow of judgment from some townspeople lingered. They whispered behind doors, questioning whether the sheriff was making a mistake. But the sheriff had learned to ignore idle gossip. He knew the truth of the woman's heart, the honesty of her intentions, and the joy her children brought into his life. That was enough for him. Through these challenges, the poor woman grew stronger too. She began to speak more confidently in the town, not as a beggar, but as a mother whose courage and honesty had earned respect. People started to see her not only as someone struggling, but as someone resilient, capable, and worthy of support. Her children flourished under this newfound stability, attending the small school in town and learning with enthusiasm. One cold evening, the sheriff and the family sat by the fire in his house. The children were busy with their homework, the woman was sewing, and the sheriff watched them quietly, feeling a sense of peace he had never known. He thought back to the night she had knocked at his door, trembling and hungry. How little they both knew then about how much that single act would change their lives. Her words, "I will end your loneliness if you give us food," had been a promise that neither of them fully understood, but it had come true in ways beyond imagination. The sheriff realized that kindness could be transformative, not just for the receiver but also for the giver. He had opened his heart and home, and in return he had found companionship, laughter, and a sense of family that he had longed for all his life. And the poor woman, once desperate and afraid, had found security, respect, and a friend who stood unwaveringly by her side. Through the trials of the town's shortage, they all learned something essential. Life was about connection, courage, and standing by one another, even when others doubted or whispered. And in that quiet small town, a family was being formed, not by blood, but by honesty, trust, and mutual care. Time passed, and the bond between the sheriff and the poor woman's family grew stronger with each day. The town slowly adjusted to the new reality. People who had once whispered and stared now began to see the sheriff's choice for what it truly was, a reflection of his character, not weakness. They began to understand that the woman and her children were honest, hard-working, and deserving of support. The sheriff, in his quiet way, had shown them the true meaning of compassion. The woman's children flourished under the sheriff's guidance. The little boy grew confident, learning not only skills for life but also the importance of integrity and kindness. He helped the sheriff with small tasks, carrying baskets or tidying the garden, proud to be useful. The girl, once shy and cautious, blossomed into a curious, bright child. She read books aloud to the sheriff and often shared stories she had learned at school. Their laughter filled the sheriff's home daily, and the walls that once echoed only silence now rang with joy, warmth, and life. For the sheriff, the house that had once felt empty was now a place of belonging. No longer did he eat alone or feel the weight of loneliness pressing against him. Each morning he watched the children play in the yard, and each night he enjoyed quiet dinners filled with conversation, small jokes, and the simple pleasure of family. The poor woman, too, felt the weight of her worries lighten. She had survived hardship, yes, but she had also discovered that courage and honesty could bring unexpected support. One afternoon, the sheriff invited her to sit by the garden as he worked. "Do you know," he said quietly, "how much you've changed my life?" She looked at him surprised. "I only came to ask for food for my children," she replied softly. "I never meant to. I never imagined this." He smiled gently. "But you did. You did more than feed your children that night. You reminded me that life is meant to be shared, that silence and solitude can be replaced with warmth and laughter if we open ourselves to it." She felt a lump in her throat, touched by his honesty. She had only sought survival, yet her presence had given the sheriff something he had longed for all his life. It was a lesson neither of them had expected, that giving and receiving kindness could create bonds stronger than any position, wealth, or reputation. As the months turned into a year, their life together became routine in the best way possible. The children attended school regularly, and the sheriff helped them with their lessons, often sitting by the fire late into the evening, helping the boy with numbers and the girl with reading. The woman found small work in town, sewing and mending for neighbors, confident that her children would be safe no matter what happened. And the sheriff, once a man known for his authority and solitude, now wore a quiet smile, touched by the love and laughter that filled his home. The townspeople, witnessing this transformation, began to respect the family even more. They saw that the woman's strength and honesty had not been diminished by hardship, and they noticed that the sheriff's kindness had not made him weaker, but stronger. Slowly, admiration replaced suspicion. People would offer help quietly, sometimes leaving small gifts of food or firewood, without speaking of it publicly. The sheriff's courage had set an example, and the town began to see the importance of compassion and support. One evening, a celebration took place in the sheriff's yard. It was a small feast made from what they had grown in the garden, what neighbors had shared, and what the sheriff provided. The children laughed and ran in circles, chasing each other, while the woman prepared the simple meal. The sheriff sat at the table with them, watching their joy with a heart full of gratitude. He realized how lonely he had once been, and how much he had missed the small, everyday moments that now filled his life. During the meal, the little girl looked up at him and said, Father, will you teach me to write a story someday?" The sheriff laughed, shaking his head gently. "Of course," he replied. "We can write stories together, stories about people who are kind, brave, and honest. And we will remember how we found each other, even when life seemed lonely and difficult." The boy, sitting beside her, added, "And I will help too. We can make our own world right here." The sheriff nodded, feeling a warmth that had been missing for years. He had authority, yes, but now he had something far more valuable: a family, love, and purpose. The woman looked at the sheriff quietly. She remembered the cold night she had knocked on his door, desperate and afraid. She remembered the words she had spoken: "I will end your loneliness if you give us food." At the time, they had seemed simple, almost naive. But now she understood the truth behind them. In asking for help, she had also given him the greatest gift he could ever receive: a chance to experience connection, warmth, and family again. The sheriff, too, reflected on that night. He realized that kindness, when offered sincerely, could transform lives. He had given food, yes, but he had also received friendship, love, and purpose in return. The lonely nights he had spent at the table alone were now a memory, replaced by shared laughter and the simple comfort of companionship. As seasons passed, the sheriff's home became a symbol of hope and community in the town. People who had once doubted the poor woman now approached her with respect. They saw the family's resilience, the sheriff's courage, and the beauty of honest hearts coming together. The town slowly learned that wealth or status mattered little when compared to kindness and honesty. One quiet morning, the sheriff, the woman, and the children sat by the fireplace, sipping tea and listening to the soft wind outside. The sheriff looked at them and said, "Do you know what your words meant that night?" The woman smiled faintly. "I know," she said softly. "I only wanted food, but somehow it became more than that." "Yes," the sheriff said. "It became everything. You ended my loneliness. You brought laughter, warmth, and family into my home. And for that, I am grateful every day." The children, sensing the seriousness of the moment, remained quiet. The little boy reached for the sheriff's hand and squeezed it gently. The girl leaned against her mother, feeling the peace that now filled their lives. And the woman, looking at the man who had once been a stranger, realized that kindness could create a family from nothing and hope from despair. From that day forward, life in the sheriff's house was full of laughter, learning, and care. The children grew strong. The woman found confidence in her role as a mother and partner in this small family, and the sheriff discovered that his life had been transformed by an unexpected act of honesty and courage. The words that had once seemed desperate, "I will end your loneliness if you give us food," had come true in the most profound way. The sheriff no longer feared the quiet nights, for his home was filled with warmth. The woman no longer worried about survival alone, for she had found a protector and friend who respected her dignity. And the children no longer knew hunger in the empty sense, for their hearts and their home were filled with love. In the end, the small town witnessed something rare and beautiful. A bond formed not out of wealth, position, or expectation, but out of honesty, courage, and simple acts of kindness. The sheriff, once lonely and distant, now had a family who depended on him and loved him. The poor woman, once desperate and alone, now had safety and respect. And the children, once hungry and afraid, now had laughter, learning, and hope for the future. It was a life transformed. A story of kindness returned, and a reminder that sometimes the smallest words spoken from a sincere heart can change the course of many lives forever.